begin by saying most people think in order to go to an ancient sacred site of great power and drama, you have to go to the Great Pyramid of Egypt or Stonehenge in Britain. That's not true. Only 45 miles due northwest of this spot is one of the world's premier sacred sites, a place you can go to, not just read about or theorize about, but a tangible place of great spiritual power that has exerted itself on this continent, not for hundreds of years, but for thousands of years. And although it is not as famous as Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid, nonetheless is well known around the world. And this place is known as Rock Lake. That's its modern name. Originally known as Tirrenia. And its story begins in historic times in the early 19th century, just about 200 years ago. The very first European pioneers were crossing from what is now Milwaukee, and then just a settlement westward. And as they crossed the plains, they came to a very thick tamarack forest. And behind this forest was this beautiful lake, 3 miles long from north to south, 1 3/4 miles wide from east to west. And when they asked the Native Americans who were the Winnebago tribe, now they call themselves the Ho-Chunk, they were told that this was the most sacred site known to them. And they referred to it as Tirrenia. And pioneers asked, well, what does Tirrenia mean? If you don't know, it's a very old name. It was used by the old ones who were here long ago. So, well, why is it such a sacred place? It's this nice lake. It makes any difference than any other lake. I said, well, there's a village of rock teepees at the bottom of this lake. And inside these rock teepees are the spirits of the old ones who named this place. So the pioneers thought, well, that's very amusing. We're going to call it Rock Lake after that. Tirrenia sounds too foreign, you know. So we'll call it Rock Lake, which is interesting because if you go to so-called Rock Lake today, there are very few rocks in it. Mostly a few at the northern end, but the rest would be more apropos to call it Mud Lake because it's very, very muddy. It's a nice lake. Nobody thought much about all this after the pioneers moved in and settled and built a little town called Lake Mills, named after the mills, naturally, that was within the lake. And then, in the year 1900, summer of 1900, there was a severe drought. During that drought, the lake levels dropped. There were 2 brother fishermen, Claude and Lee Wilson. They were out there on the lake just fishing, like people do today. They looked over the side of their boat. The lake had been lowered substantially and had cleared up. Like most state lakes, it's rather turbid. There's all kinds of agricultural runoff and so on, algae blooms. So you can't see things too clearly, but during a prolonged drought, things got cleared up. They looked over the side of the boat. Lo and behold, they saw what they described as a large stone building underneath the surface of Rock Lake. So they rode furiously back to town, told everybody about it, and soon a flotilla of curious sightseers was out on the lake, wondering if the so-called rock teepees that the Indians had talked about so long before really exist after all. And sure enough, here is this large black building looming up from the bottom of Rock Lake. And dozens, possibly hundreds, you know, but a large crowd was out looking at this lake. Even people would free dive on it. In other words, of course, there was scuba gear and even hard hats, I don't believe in those days, certainly not in Wisconsin. And they jumped over and they swam down and they could touch the top of it. And as they swam down, they said, this is definitely a building. It has sloping sides. It looks like a kind of a pyramid. Not like they have in Egypt, but it's nonetheless pyramidal. So word spread all over Lake Mills, all over the southern part of Wisconsin, until the word finally got back to a reporter who was dispatched from the Milwaukee Herald Tribune, a newspaper that no longer exists, to investigate this phenomenon. So he gets on the train from Milwaukee. In those days, you could take a train directly from Milwaukee to Lake Mills. And there was a train station. Backtrack a little bit on that. They first had a hint that there was something really strange about Rock Lake when they made that train station. Because they put the train station on the southern end of the lake, that's the place to put it. And in order to do that, they had to clear a hill. And some people said that hill looks very unusual because it was very high and very sharply defined. I wonder if that was man-made. Well, progress being what it was, get rid of it. But in the train station, as they did so, out of this mound came thousands upon thousands of skulls, mostly skulls, human skulls, thousands of bones, huge amounts. Well, things being what they were back then, a lot of trophies, a lot of souvenirs, and so it's all gone. But a number of them existed for quite a while in museums. But anyway, so people thought, well, maybe there was something strange about that. Well, anyway, the reporter from the Milwaukee Herald Tribune gets off the train station at Lake Mills. Fortunately, by then, he was on his way. The drought was over. There was a major cloudburst. So when everybody got back on their boats, they rowed out and said, yes, there's the pyramid down there. All the great visibility that had been made available from the drought was gone. It was all turbid again. Yes, what's there? All he interviewed people in town. Yes, we saw it. We drove on and so on. Goes back to Milwaukee, and everybody's anxious to see this reportage and this great find at Lake Mills. They open the newspapers and they find out that the gentleman from the Milwaukee Herald Tribune says that the people of Lake Mills have all been engaged in a hoax in order to get tourism into their town. There's nobody would pay any attention to otherwise. So from that point on, people of Lake Mills were very closed-mouthed when it came to asking about the lost pyramids of Rock Lake. Be that as it may, from that time forward, every once in a while, fishermen would catch their nets on objects that weren't supposed to be there, or if the lake would clear up for one reason or another, different parts of it, people did claim to glimpse things from time to time. So a kind of a lore, a folklore, built up over time. Until in the 1930s, about 1931, there was a school teacher by the name of Victor Taylor. And Victor Taylor was a Lake Mills school teacher who was very devoted to the prehistory of Wisconsin and said there might be something to the so-called pyramids or structures in the lake. And what he did is he interviewed those people that had witnessed the 1900 site. Further than that, he went back and talked to the elders of a number of tribes, not just the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, but also the Sioux, and won their confidence to the extent that they shared these traditions about Rock Lake being a sacred site. One of them, his name was Pamida, shared everything that he knew about Rock Lake. He wasn't supposed to do it because it was part of his lodge tradition. But he was on his deathbed, so he thought, so he shared everything he knew. Unfortunately for him, from his perspective, he recovered. Therefore was founded in American history. But his name was Pamida. And he said, the word Tiranena means Lake of the Moon. And the reason why we call it Lake of the Moon is because there's a very big temple down there. The Temple of the Moon. Oh, is it oriented to the moon? No. And why is it dedicated to the goddess of the moon? No. Why is this called this lunar symbolism going on? It says because for the ancient people, the lunar qualities of life represented the other side. You see the sun during the day, it illuminates everything. Consciousness. Darkness comes, darkness associated with ignorance. The moon comes out, sheds its own special light, inner knowledge. So the Lake of the Moon represents a place of great spiritual knowledge, good for me to say. So Victor Taylor, this great educator, collected in a very scientific manner, not only local traditions, but Native American myths, which all seem to pertain to this place as a place of great spiritual energies, in which there was not only one structure down there, but many. Hamida and others said that Rock Lake, or Tiranena, was a necropolis, a city of the dead, where the ancients interred their most valuable people. Victor Taylor, being an English teacher, had some respect locally, and he won more respect at the University of Wisconsin when he presented, not a thesis exactly, but his papers, saying that perhaps there is something to what's in Rock Lake. And a kind of Rock Lake fever developed all of a sudden. People said, well, let's go into the lake, let's find out if there's anything down there. Let's really investigate. This is in the days before scuba gear. This is early 1930s. So he was actually almost foisted upon him a grant from the University of Wisconsin to go investigate the lake. So the only thing we had to investigate in those days were hard hat divers. You know, they had these big bulbous brass things and these lead weights at their feet. And so they hired 2 divers to go over the side and look at Rock Lake. Oh, they'll find them for sure. Well, they're clomping around at the bottom of the lake, and it's all silt and mud. And every footstep, they take great billows of mud here, and they're clomping around the bottom of Rock Lake all day, 2 days actually. They came up and they said, there's nothing down there, not a thing. We were all over the bottom of Rock Lake. Of course, they didn't say the visibility was about this far. The pyramid could be this far, they wouldn't see it, the structure. Well, that had a rather chilling effect, should we say, on the authorities. They said, we spent all this money, and worse than that, a reputation, trying to verify the pyramids of Rock Lake, and you've involved us in a hoax, Mr. Taylor. And so, people of Rock Lake, Lake Mills, again, were subjected to a kind of embarrassing situation, and Victor Taylor became to be the focus of outrage. And here this poor guy that had done this research for all these years was literally booted out of town and had to leave Lake Mills. It's amazing. Here we are, nice Wisconsin, and sometimes you think that's not so nice, and they hounded him out of town. And he died in obscurity. Interestingly enough, he claimed that he was able to pinpoint some of the structures with using a diving team. He was originally against the idea of hard hat divers going into the lake just because he knew it was mud. He says they're just going to stir up this mud, you won't see anything. So what he did is he hired what is known as free divers. In other words, they just in swimming trunks dive down into the lake and hold their breath for a long time. And they claim to have actually seen what they said looked like Indian teepees. They couldn't stay down very long. Dark shadows, kind of pyramidal shapes, but not like in Egypt. Different. Something like ice cream cones turned upside down. But all that was lost in the unfortunate scandal that resulted with hard hat divers. So everybody wanted to forget about the pyramids of Rock Lake. And then World War II came along. In the early 1940s, Madison, outside of Madison, there was the United States Army Air Force Base where they trained pilots and navigators on board B-17s. And the B-17 pilots would use in their training various points of reference to try out their Norton bomb sights. And one of the sites that they often used was Rock Lake because it was large, but not that large. You're up at about 13 or 20,000 feet. And these Norton bomb sights were fabulous. Of course, they had telescopic sights and everything else. And interestingly enough, these bomber pilots reported seeing what looked like buildings at the bottom of the lake. Man-made structures. It said far too, and here these were now trained observers to look for targets, to look for man-made objects. And many of them said that when we flew over Rock Lake, we would see things that looked, I spoke to some of them, that looked like man-made structures. About this time, a very great man who is not well known, Max Gene Knowles, a native of Wisconsin. He is the true inventor of the scuba gear. All the huge scuba industry was invented by him, not Jacques Cousteau. This is not to take away from Jacques Cousteau. It was just what happened during World War II. Things got confused. There were more important things going on. But Max Gene Knowles was a professional diver. He held all kinds of records for the deepest dives that human beings ever undertook into the 1940s. And he specifically invented the scuba gear to go looking for the lost pyramids of Rock Lake. It's not well known. Its own breathing apparatus. And he claims to have found at least one of them. He described it as being on the south end of the lake in a kind of a trench. That the structure was about 20 feet high. You have to figure that underwater it's very difficult to gauge direction, especially in instrumentation in those days, height, with things like that. We describe this structure as being about 20 feet tall, made out of rock, not dressed stone, that had been piled up into the shape of an ice cube going upside down. That report was just lost in all the events of World War II. He died in a car accident shortly after World War II. As destiny would have it, his scuba gear invention was picked up by Jacques Cousteau, who popularized it, but unfortunately did not give him the credit that he deserved. All throughout the 1940s, after World War II, and into the 50s, more and more fishermen, who were now had scuba gear, were encountering strange things in the lake. The lake had very poor visibility because it was a farm on the western end called the Court Farm. And that farm was guilty of massive agricultural pollution. They had all kinds of agricultural runoff, and this spawned algae bloom. So you really only had a couple of seasons you had a chance to see it. Well, I came into this by accident. I don't mean to talk about myself. This is not a personal thing, but it's part of the history. I read an article in Skin Diver magazine in 1987 about the so-called lost pyramids of Rock Lake to summarize some of the things I've been discussing here. And I thought, I know divers, it's a diver's hoax, that's all. They're just, I want to go up and I want to make sure I'll put this little controversy to rest, you know. So I went out with a friend of mine, we stood at the end of Rock Lake and we saw how absolutely turbid and polluted it was. I figured, no, diving's not going to work, so we'll get an airplane. We'll fly over the lake, and we'll see if there's really anything in it or not. This will tell, you know. And I didn't know anything about that had come before, but I was not the first person that had used an aircraft to use archaeological reconnaissance, as it were. And others had had success that I didn't know about. So my photographer was a friend who worked with the Chicago Sun-Times, so the photographs he'd take would be pretty damn good. So we got a plane out of neighboring Watertown, and we happened to fly over in March. Realized that that's an optimum time to go because the cold ice has retreated, the warm weather has not yet set in, and so you've got a kind of a short space of time where the water is relatively clear. Same thing happens in fall. And there's a temperature inversion, clear thing. But the rest of the time, forget it. Even in wintertime, it's bad. Summertime, it's horrible. Little time in early spring, late fall, about now, it's pretty good. There's a chance to see stuff. So we're flying over in March 1987. We flew over very low, like about 500 feet. Saw nothing. Could look down into the lake. Visibility was fabulous from up there. Some peculiar shapes, but there are peculiar shapes everywhere. So I told the pilot, I said, well, maybe we're too close. I said, let's go a little higher. I said, take us up to about maybe 3,000 feet. So he took us up to about 4,000 feet. Still nothing. We flew around the south end of the lake, and there the three of us saw something that changed our lives. Because clearly, the south end of the lake was a massive triangular platform. No way could this have been made by natural forces. Definitely man-made. Massive. We tried to guess how big it was. Some of us thought maybe it's 200 feet long on one side. Others thought maybe it's 400 feet long. As it turns out, it's 900 feet long on each side. It's a perfect triangular belt. So when we saw that, the pilot, who had heard about the lost pyramids of Rock Lake, thinking it was just a joke, he was amazed. He says, this has really changed my life. So from that point on, we were dedicated to find hard proof, not just these photographs that we took, and I'll show you some of the better ones today, right? That there is something in the lake. And so between 1987 and I guess really at the present moment, we have been conducting dives and surveys. We've got literally dozens of enthusiasts like ourselves. We've tried to engage the archaeological establishment. Some archaeologists have come on board, notably Professor James Sherry, Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's been tremendous help. And I myself have had over 100 dives in Rock Lake, specifically looking for these structures. Very difficult dives to do because the visibility is so poor, very much a changeover. Out of those 100 dives, I've had about 10 sightings, maybe 8, but they have been magnificent. I have to wrap this up. I can tell you basically what we're looking at the bottom of Rock Lake. And what Rock Lake is. Rock Lake is the remains of a glacial action that carved out a little valley. When the glaciers retreated, you know this whole area, of course, was glaciated. When the glaciers retreated, they carved out canyons like Kettle Moraine and places like that. And they also carved out this little valley. And at the northern end of this little valley, they deposited a pond called the Glacial Pond. This happened about 10,000 years ago. Due north of what is now Rock Lake, there was, in ancient times, a pretty good-sized river. Part of it ran west to east, just due north of Rock Lake. As a matter of fact, when you go to, let's say you're taking a drive between Milwaukee and Madison, if you're careful, you notice the area, you'll see you're driving in the bottom of an extinct riverbed, or a river that's extinct. Just to know all this is not theory. And over time, this river spilled itself into the glacial valley. Now, how did it do that? We didn't find it. We figured that that's what was going on. That's what caused the lake. This river emptied itself into this valley. As recently as 1994, the first Landsat survey of this area was done. Actually, the entire country. They found out something that had puzzled geologists, something they had suspected for a long time but did not know for sure until then. And that is that the entire southern half of Wisconsin, on a line from Milwaukee all the way to the Mississippi, is sinking at the rate of a foot per century, 12 inches per century. That's a lot. That's fast geologically. They had suspected this because some of the old farming houses that go back quite a ways, in the 1820s or 30s, they were built quite well. Their stone foundations are all leaning at the same angle. What it amounts to is that we are still on the isostatic rebound of the glaciers that retreated from here 9,000 years ago. The land is still rebounding, causing the southern part of Wisconsin to, like on a Venetian blind, turning like this, a foot per century. That's what spilled the lake into the valley. So this valley was slowly filled with water. Around that pond, which was very small, somebody came and built magnificent structures. Several of them, at least, still exist. I can tell you what one looks like today. We had a particularly superb sighting. We made a major effort. The gods were kind. The water cleared. We had about 30 feet visibility. For Rock Lake, that's stupendous. And we found it was, at that time, standard sonar, state-of-the-art sonar. Not just fish finders, although they come in handy too. And you dive over, this is this 1991 dive I'm telling you about, which is really the best sighting we've ever had so far. Dive over the side, and for about the first 30 feet, you're just diving through this liquid emerald. It's really nice and warm. It's very pleasant. And you just follow what we did. First of all, we found the target with our sonar, went over, dropped an anchor nearby, popped a buoy. So then when you get in the water, you just follow that yellow line down. Follow the yellow line. And then at 30 feet, there's something known as the thermal climb. This is where the warm water sits on top of cold water. As you dive through it, the first part of your body is freezing cold, and the rest is still warm. So it's like you're diving into, I guess, much darker. The visibility was good. And as I went below the thermal climb, visibility cleared up. You can see a tremendous panorama on the bottom of the lake. Mud, all muddy. But directly below me, the yellow line went straight down to it, looked exactly like a paved road going across the bottom of the lake. Just perfectly straight. Paved road. As you got closer to it, you can see it's not a paved road because the middle of it rose up. Was this the whole thing? No, only the very top of it, because the bottom of Rock Lake is silty. We don't even know how deep that silt is. Incredibly deep. Below that is hard mud and clay. So this thing, who knows how big it really is. You're just seeing the top of this thing. You swim down to it and you can see that, yes, these are just rocks. They're not dressed or shaped, but they are piled in an orderly fashion. And the top of it, archaeologists call this type of mound, with good reason, a ridge-top mound, because it is a straight ridge. Not like something left by a glacier, which would be kind of straight, but would wiggle this way. This is absolutely dead straight, north-south. And at the end, when you come to the end, that's the most dramatic. When you get to the end of this, it looks like a paved road. Very crude. It is a ruin. It's been sitting down there a long time. Perfectly triangular at both ends. Absolutely straight triangle. It goes down in the mud. So you Go down the mud, you put your face into the mud, and you reach down. How far is this? Down, down, down. I don't have much time. Our subsequent research, what we would do, we're just amateurs. I'm not an archaeologist. I have no training in that whatsoever. I'm just an enthusiast. What we do is we collect data. We wouldn't touch these things as little as possible. Photographs is what we always wanted more than anything else. But we did take some samples. And we did find some interesting things. One of the things that we took was off one side of this structure, this pyramidal structure, exactly like Native Americans said. Rock teepees. Some of them do kind of look like rock teepees. And off this one side, we took what looked like a kind of cement. And when we showed it, first of all, to the archaeologists, they said, oh, well, that's just marl. But marl is a kind of a natural process that develops with limestone. That's just marl, just by looking at it. I said, well, maybe it is, probably is, but I'm going to take this to a geologist and have it tested. So I got the best geologist I could, Dr. Martin Flowers, University of Chicago. He had all university testing equipment at his disposal. I said, I didn't know anything about where this came from, what it was. I said, what is this? Is this man-made or natural? No problem. So he looked at it under electron microscope and did a little report for me. He says, there's no problem at all. This is definitely man-made. He says, it's kind of a plaster, a kind of plaster, where people would, he knows how they did it. They would grind up mollusk shells, he said, combine it with water and clay and a few other things, gravel, and they'd create this beautiful plaster that would be kind of whitish pink, he said, and because of the mollusks that are ground up in it, would be decorative, it would glint in the sun. So these structures that we're seeing down there, they look like rude rock piles now, although beautifully formed, were in fact completely covered with a plaster, so that when you would have seen it in real life, it would have had this beautiful pinkish-white sheen to it, glinting in the sun, a little mother of pearl through it. We suspect, although there's no proof so far, but we suspect that it's possible that they were also painted with geometrical designs. So it would have been a very interesting thing to see. Now, what are these things? What are they used for? They're related to a culture which is called the Adena. I'm not going to get into that, but archaeologists know who the Adena were. Those of you who are familiar with this, the Adena go back about 3,000 years. Actually, it's much earlier in this part of the world. What the Adena did is they made mounds similar to this. Not exactly, but similar. So what they would do for their honored dead is they dig a trench, they lay their honored dead out there, and then they just cover them over with dirt, and then they would heap up these big rock piles. Very geometrical, very nicely. It's not known that the Adena ever used a plaster. Maybe the Adena represented kind of degeneracy from some higher culture, we don't know. But the structures of the bottom of the rock lake most resemble these Adena ridge-top mounds. Now, as time passed, and the river continued to spill itself into the valley, these pyramids, these old pyramids themselves, became slowly flooded. And at higher levels, another people came into this area. And they built structures which were totally different, but are still known to Native Americans. They call them Pokasawa pits. The name Pokasawa is such a sacred word, they will not tell us what it means. But we know what it refers to. It refers to a family vault, a family crypt. They resemble volcanoes. They're perfectly circular. They are not plastered, rough rock again. And if you go over to the top of them, they have a crater in the center. And that crater is for surviving family members to sit in and meditate on the dead around them, buried in the walls of this circular structure, on part of a vision quest. And those you see at the bottom of Rock Lake. We found several. The most dramatic find was made, first of all, by a nanny back in the 1920s. She used to live across on the west side of Rock Lake, and it was a well-to-do family on the east side, and she used to walk across Rock Lake during wintertime when it was all iced up. And she said one time she walked across Rock Lake, and she looks down through the ice, and she said what looks like an amphitheater. She said, it looks like an amphitheater. And we know pretty much where she saw it. We could never find it. She said, big amphitheater. We never found it. In 1992, there was a show called, what's the one with Robert Stack? What was that? Unsolved Mysteries? Yeah,
that's it.
They went out there to Rock Lake. And they had fabulous underwater television cameras and everything else. Boy, it was great. You could be on board and you watch the television, you could see the divers underwater. They searched all over and they found that structure. It's a large, fairly large, not huge, but it's a pretty good-sized Pokasawa pit. I don't know how big the whole thing is because most of it's under silt like everything else. We fit about half a dozen divers right in the Vision Quest area. There's no way that this could have been made by natural processes. A glacier drags, doesn't create vertically circular structures. Then, as time passed, and the water level rose north, the river spilled into this river valley, these structures were flooded. And at the 20-foot level, you find these ice cream cone-like structures, like ice cream cones turned upside down. They appear to be sundials. They are not places of bearing. They appear to be related to charting the movements of the sun in regards to time. And that's important because the people who were buried at Rock Lake were miners. We know that for a fact because one of the graves, there used to be thousands of graves around Rock Lake. They're all gone now. Industrial development. That those graves contained the bodies of miners because the archaeologists found mining tools with these old skeletons. Or were you going to go mining in Wisconsin? No place. You are going to go mining in Michigan, because that's the other great half of this mystery I do not have time for. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan contains a mystery which should have been taught in all your schools and even your grandfather's schools. It's never been discussed in polite academic society because it's a mystery that the archaeological establishment cannot explain. That is, that at the time that Egypt was new, when Egypt just got started, first dynasty, 5,000 years ago, somebody was right here, and I mean in Wisconsin, specifically in Michigan, who were sophisticated miners, who were able to drill shafts down 60 feet from solid limestone, who had machines. Some of those machines still exist. Levers, no, they're not like things you can plug in the wall, but machines nonetheless, who could lift something like 6 tons of solid copper. And these people, wherever they were, these miners, they removed a conservative, an ultra-conservative amount of 500 million pounds of the world's highest grade copper between 3000 BC and 1200 BC. And not one scrap of that mined copper is to be found in the United States. It vanished. And at the same time, 3000 BC, 1200 BC, the Bronze Age erupted in Europe. And that's important because there are no major high-grade copper deposits in Europe. And yet somebody was here excavating this prodigious amount of copper, which vanished. So archaeologists go over here saying, oh, where did all the copper go? And archaeologists are in Europe saying, where did all this copper come from? Well, right here. And Rock Lake is important from that point of view because it's part of our important prehistory that there were people here long before Columbus who were doing important things, making a tremendous impact on the prehistory of our continent. In a spiritual point of view, because that's what a lot of you are interested in, Rock Lake has had a draw, has had an attraction that still exists, a palpable feeling of familiarity that people claim, sometimes fear. I've talked to people that have lived for generations in Lake Mills and said they rarely go to the lake because they're afraid. There's an unspoken anxiety. There have been numerous paranormal experiences reported at Rock Lake, and I don't mean recently. You talk to the Native Americans, for example, the Oneida Indians used to live in that area a little bit, not long, before they were kicked out by the Sioux or kicked out by the Winnebago. And they talk about that as being a sacred place where things appear and disappear. Why is this? Why is it we have this long tradition of this being a spiritually potent place, which is still revered as a sacred site today? Professor Nobuhiro Yoshida, who is one of probably Japan's most famous, he is to Japan what Carl Sagan used to be to America, extremely well-known scientist. He knew about Rock Lake, came out here and visited with his wife, and they regarded it as a place of great reverence. When I was in Cusco, Peru, 11 years ago, I met a shaman, an Aymara Indian shaman, who was telling me about Rock Lake, who knew about Rock Lake in Peru. I said, how on earth have you ever known about this? He said, well, the answer is at Lake Titicaca. It says our own lake. Go out to Lake Titicaca. So I went out to Lake Titicaca, and There are structures around the shore of Lake Titicaca which are the same as at the bottom of the Rock Lake. Same structures. Rude-looking, crude structures. What can account for this? I believe that the explanation, possible explanation, is in this geologic change that I've told you about, where you have the southern part of Wisconsin, which is still on the rebound. When there's major geologic changes like that, when there's, for example, before a major earthquake, people experience all kinds of visionary type experiences. So it's conceivable that human nature is somehow plugged into the earth energies, and when they are focused or energized, somehow brought to some kind of a concentration, we experience the spiritual. And of course, Rock Lake, being a place, a body of water, will amplify those experiences. That's my only explanation. But nonetheless, Rock Lake, you cannot regard it dispassionately. Whether or not you have any preconceptions about the paranormal, diving in there is a major experience. And it has the Welsh had a term for this called hereth. Hereth means a feeling of not being in the right place at the right time. For example, let's say you're walking down a corridor in a building somewhere, major building, and you go into behind this door, and it's not the door you expected, and everybody in this meeting looks up at you. You're not where you're supposed to be. It's that kind of a feeling. The search for the lost pyramids of Rock Lake has not ended. Probably never will. However, there's good news. The fourth farm shut down. There's no more agricultural runoff. And as a consequence, the water has cleared up tremendously. My wife and I were just there yesterday. We passed by on our way to this place. This video looks great. I felt like tearing off my clothes and getting in the water immediately. But the water was a bit chilly, but everything's a trade-off, right? So, your wetsuit, or your dry suit, whatever. The water has cleared up tremendously. It's very vivid now. Great visibility. It took about 3 years to get over it. So we are mounting another expedition that will take place, hopefully, in April. And in April, I have all the volunteers, the equipment necessary, and we're after one specific target. We really want to photograph. The problem has been up to this point that these structures are so big that to take photographs of them when you only have visibility, even if you have improved visibility by 20 feet, the photographs that you've taken for the most part are like, well, that's a pile of rocks. Because when you're underwater, there's a distortion factor. Things that are curved normally, they flatten out. So it's very, underwater photography is extremely difficult. But now that the visibility is cleared up, we can step further back. There's one structure that we're really looking forward to finding. It's called the Knob, by locals. You know exactly where it is, or where it should be. It is one of those Pokasawa pits that I told you about. It's only like about 20 feet under the water, that's all. But it's small, much smaller than any of the others. It looks like it's maybe only about 18 feet at its base, or perhaps maybe 6 feet high. Now that's small enough to fit into the viewfinder of an underwater camera. We're hoping to get just the prime photograph. It's a strange thing. Things appear and disappear at the lake all the time. I've seen the Pokasawa pit numerous times. I dove on it. You could dive on it even without scuba gear. You can see it. And the last 2 times we were out there, we could not find it. We had grid search, everything. What happened to it? The funniest story in that regard was a rock that appeared off of what's called Topol's. It's a place where you can rent boats and so on the south end of the lake. And Mr. and Mrs. Topol shared this story with me. They said, one day they looked out, not too far from the lake shore, and it's very calm, and there's a great boulder out there. I've never seen that boulder before. It's a big boulder. So I'm like, boy, we better figure out some way to remove that. It would be a navigational hazard. So as it turned out, people used to like the rock. They never ran into it. They'd go out and swim to it. It was there for a couple of years. This big boulder, huge. And then after about 3 years, they looked out one day, and it was gone. It wasn't there anymore. They said, somebody hauled our boulder away? It's like conceivable. Go out and drag it, like about 50 feet into shore. Why would they do such a dumb thing anyway? And about a year later, it reappeared in the exact same spot. And people said, oh, we're glad, Mr. Topol, you put that boulder back. When I told this story to an Oneida shaman, he laughed. He said, "Be sure nobody is on that boulder when it disappears. They're going to go someplace." But I can tell you all kinds of stories, all kinds of visionary things people are seeing, mostly feeling. After we'd had that just one more on that. After we'd had this really successful dive into the lake, and we'd seen this structure in the lake, there was an Oneida kid, actually. He looked like he was about 18 or 19, long black hair, and he's a very quiet guy. He asked if he could go along on our boat. I said, "Yeah, sure, come along." You know, he didn't get in anybody's way. He had nothing to say. We were all excited. Oh, we got photographs and all this stuff. So he came up to me and he said, "Oh, congratulations on the success." I said, "Well, yeah, what did you think of it?" I asked him. He said, "Well, we know about this place for a long time." He says, "It's okay for you to go down there and look at it and photograph it, but don't touch it or anything. You know, don't take anything away." I said, "No, of course not. I can't do it to that." And he said, "Yeah," he says, "it's very important that you don't touch anything because the spirit guardian will be angry." "That spirit guardian?" And he says, yeah. So I was flippant, you know, and I said, "Oh, yeah, well, what will it do to me if I got the spirit guardian? You know, that sounds pretty exciting, funny." So he says, but he was serious. He said, "No, there's a spirit guardian gun." He said, "Well, it won't do anything." He says, "When you're in the water, it'll just look at the lantern of your soul." Boy, that chilled me. Because I could just imagine diving through this black water with this little firefly of the light of my soul, and here's this thing looking at me. And not after there, but long before, I did have a feeling of presence in the lake. There's a real presence, a living presence, like there's something there. People have said they've spotted lake monsters and things like that. That's just the way the psychological maybe. Well, I'm going to stop here because I don't want to waste my time. And I'm going to show the best slides I'm able to get so far. And hopefully the next time I see you, I'll have some better photographs. These aren't too shabby, though. This is Rock Lake, seen from about 3,800 feet, looking south to north. And let's see if this will work. This is the way that Rock Lake used to look. This is a map that was compiled by Professor Scher at the University of Madison, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And this is speculated on the date, 1500 BC. All this area that you're looking at now is underwater at this time. This is the way the lake looks. This is where two of the structures are. This is interesting. The one that I dove on, I told you about, looked like a road. That's this one, C2. There's another one, C3, in more ruinous condition behind it. What's interesting, as Professor Scher has pointed out, is that both of these structures are right on the former lake level. And this is an effigy mound over here. Effigy mound is a certain type of mound that's made to represent an animal, a thing, a geometrical shape. And here we have an effigy mound, which, according to the Oneida Indians, say is a bear mound. Why a bear? Because they just like bears? No. It fits in with the necropolis, or the funerary theme of this spot. The bear is a symbol of death and rebirth. The bear goes into hibernation in his cave. He goes into the earth. He looks like he's dead for a long time in the winter. And then he comes alive again. This is, to the Native Americans, was a symbol of regeneration. So we're getting something of the old religion that was behind these structures. They didn't just believe in death, apparently. They believed in an afterlife, or at least a regeneration. Now, this is one of the first glimpses we had of this triangular formation you can see here on the south end of the lake. Now, the southern edge of this structure, it looks rather choppy because there's mud flowing over the top of it. It's not very deep. Here's a close-up of that. I have that little upside down. There are these two stone mounds on the north end of it.
Excuse me, question.
Yes.
Has anyone measured the angle of that? Is that 19.5?
It's very difficult to measure something as accurately as that.
I mean, right there, just to measure that.
As far as I know, that has not happened.
Okay.
It needs to be done. Now, this is a sonar image that was made of that same triangle. Now, what's interesting about the sonar, it will not go through the mud. That's too heavy, or clay. But it will go through the silt. Silt doesn't mean anything. So what this reveals, and not only the size of this structure, this is the sonar image, but it also reveals that it's made up of stages or steps, which you cannot see because it's deep under the silt. So it's an interesting structure. Here's a close-up of that again. This is at an angle where it had about 1,000 feet here. These are two stone mountains at the north end. They look like eyes. This is just a simple sketch of our torpedo that was used for the sonar. The sonar is in the nose, would be pulled behind our boat. The sonar, of course, is a device which sends down an electronic pulse. The pulse bounces off of a target. The information is then sent back electronically into a computer on board the ship, which can literally paint a picture in sound. So our first sound photograph here was made with these structures. This white line represents the wake of our boat. We found 5 of these structures. What you're looking at here, these white cone areas, that is a shadow created by the sound, the sonar sound. We are right over these structures. It goes at an angle. So this will give you some idea of the shape of it. Again, it's that cone shape. Then we used another type of sonar that was able to fine-tune that image. And these are the structures. They're very shallow, 16 feet. These cone-shaped mounds made out of stone. And then we finally found this one. The top has been knocked off. You can see how it's rising from the silt. Beautifully made. You have to understand that it's a ruin caused mostly by fishermen who have been throwing out their nets and their anchors for many years, and so the top has collapsed. This is hollow inside. Now this is a model that's at the Land Museum, so that if this structure were on land, it would most resemble, this is what it most resembled would look like. This is an overhead view of that same structure. Now, what really was important in finding this was this rock. It's very red. When I showed this photograph, I did not remove the rock, nothing is removed. But when I showed this rock to the head of the Land Museum, he was able to determine that it is Hickstonite. Hickstonite is regarded as a stone of great spiritual importance to all Native Americans in the Wisconsin and Michigan area. And it is not native to the Rock Lake area. So this rock is important to show that it was some sacred stone that was brought to the lake and incorporated into the structure from Hickston, Wisconsin. This is the structure that we refer to as the knob. So like a little volcano, the Native Americans refer to as a Pokasawa pit. Around its walls here's a close-up of that other one, I'll get back to that. This shows the red nature of that stone. In its walls are the buried dead, family members. And in the crater at the center, that's where you have your vision quest. It's neatly done, nicely alternating large and small rocks. Now, when we showed this evidence to the archaeologists, some of them said, well, there is something going on. Others said, it's just all divers' jokes. Now, constructing things like this underwater, believe me, isn't easy. So, this is an overhead view of that same structure I showed you, or a Pokasawa pit. This is the one we're going to try to find, called Mound. This is what the structures looked like originally. What you're seeing, the photograph, is only this part, the bottom part. The fishermen with their anchors and nets have knocked off. Now, this lithograph is interesting. It comes from the early 1800s. These very same structures that you find at the bottom of Rock Lake extend in a line from Rock Lake all the way up to the mining area on the Upper Peninsula, Kewanee Peninsula of Michigan. Why would anybody build these things? There are no bodies underneath. They're time indicators, because Rock Lake sits not only on this geologic fault that I told you of, but it also sits just below the hard snow line, the hard winter line. So if you're doing mining up in the Upper Peninsula, you better get out of there before the winter closes in, because it'd be impossible. You would be stranded up there. So they had to have these sundials indicating the time all the way from Rock Lake up into the Upper Peninsula. So they had to constantly watch them to make sure that they left in plenty of time. And it is interesting that these structures are found from the bottom of Rock Lake straight up all the way. Of course, now they've all been torn down, by farmers. They used the stone for walls and wells that were just in the way. This is another one of the structures, one of the smaller ones. It's very ruinous. It's on top of a larger mound. It's also hollow. Whether it contains something or not, we don't know. Obviously, it's fallen down a lot. We're looking at ruins. What you find, and this is, of course, on land. This is a typical Native American fire pit used for cooking and everything else. Nothing ceremonial. But you find a lot of these on the west end of Rock Lake, at about 20 to 30 feet down. Here's one of them. You can barely make it out. Also circular fire pit. So it shows habitation in the area that is now covered by water. Let's see our clay models of the two basic types of structures you find at the bottom of Rock Lake. In other words, the oldest part of Rock Lake. This is the ridgetop mound. This one is a kind of a Pocasala pit, only it doesn't have the crater at the top. You find this structure also about 60 to 40 feet. And if you were going inside these structures, this is what you'd find. Layers of construction and the bodies laid out. This is the flanks of that large structure that's 100 feet long. You can barely make it out. Unless you knew what you were looking at, it would make no sense. This is why underwater photography is so difficult. I only have about 12 feet visibility here. Now things have cleared up, we might get better photographs. This is a rendering of the structure. This was done by a fellow by the name of Jack Kennedy. When he found these structures in 1967, he had a good eye view of what these things look like. This is pretty much what they look like today. They're a little more ruinous. They're not quite in good condition as is shown here, but very similar. This is one of the few bones that have been removed from inside one of the pyramids. And that's interesting because all the bones found so far are the same. They're all deer bones. Now, not only are they deer bones, but they've all been cracked like this. This is the way they were found, cracked. That's interesting because Native Americans, at least their ancestors anyway, would have funeral feasts with deer. Deer is another symbol of regeneration and rebirth because the antlers have this kind of a velvet that peels off and then regenerates itself. It's another regeneration thing. And they crack the bones to remove the marrow inside. So is this the remains of a funeral feast? Very probably. There are no deer anywhere near Rock Lake. Haven't been for a long time. It's all overdeveloped. So this bone we had analyzed. There's no way to determine how old it is because of all the accretions and so forth on it. All they know is it's very old, whatever that means. However, these finds, these artifacts are far more convincing. I took both of these stones to the Beloit College. You're probably familiar with Beloit College. And the analysis of these artifacts was interesting. The structure on the right here, this is a hand tool for working hides. This is a man-formed brick. It's a natural stone man-formed brick. They did hydrochloric tests on it and found tool marks on it. My time is running out fast. And that is all, except I'll just one thing. The question is, how far back do these things go? How old is this? How old is Rock Lake? The structure's in there. The lake itself, the little pond, goes back to glacial times, about 9,000, 10,000 years ago. The structures that were made around it, however, appear to date back to 5,000 years ago, even though archaeologists balk at the suggestion of such a thing. But what's interesting is that these structures found at the bottom of Rock Lake, according to the latest hydraulic studies, indicate that these structures, being 5,000 years old, are the same period of time that the copper mining began in Upper Michigan. So it all begins to fit, the themes seem to fit in. The lake finally rose up to its last prehistoric level, really fairly recently, about 1,000 years ago. And what's interesting is that those mounds correspond to people known as the Hopewell. And the Hopewell were all through this area. They were the ones who built the effigy mounds. And they probably regarded Rock Lake as a sacred place for their dead. Then the last surge took place in 1820 when the mills were put in, that gave Lake Mills its name, and flooded that triangle. That triangle that we saw was above water when the first Europeans came here. And when you dive on that triangle today, as I have, you will find fencing, 19th century fencing still down. So what I urge you very much to do is someday, if you get a chance, please go to Rock Lake. Try to think of some of the things we've discussed here and described here. And I know there's too much information here, there's danger of information overload, but I think if you just leave yourself open to the impressions of Rock Lake, you'll find that you're in a very sacred site, a real sacred site. It's only a small chapter of this device, this thing, and it is a device, that was known long before the Hebrews came out and seen them, long afterwards. What they refer to as the Ark of the Covenant is known as the Aron HaBarit, and it is so sacred. Aron HaBarit is Hebrew for Ark of the Covenant. It's so sacred that it cannot be discussed. It refers, the Ark itself only refers to the box in which the thing is contained. And the word covenant means a kind of an agreement, a special relationship between this thing and the people that can operate it. And the story of this, the earliest, or I should say, to be perfectly honest, one of the earliest references to this object begins in, what? We have 60 minutes. Oh, good. Plenty of time, right? If I stumble around on here, it's because my mind is loaded with so much stuff, and I don't want to give you information overload. It's amazing you're quiet, because you've had so much great stuff given to you today tonight. But the beginnings, among the earliest beginnings of this story, of the Ark of the Covenant, long before it was called the Ark of the Covenant, long predating the Hebrews, goes back to the oldest myth of ancient Egypt. And the myth of ancient Egypt is how the Egyptians came to be, how Egyptian civilization came to be, is preserved by an Egyptian who worked during early Roman times. He collected, thank God, he collected all these oral traditions and wrote them down. His name was Manetho. By the way, since I've been on this trail, I want you to know that as much information as I'm giving you, I'm simplifying it, is all material that you can find out yourself. This is not channeled material. I don't have that ability. This is all factual material that you can get through sources available through interlibrary loan or through the internet. It's not that esoteric. And Manetho is a wonderful source for the Egyptian mind, how the ancient Egyptians and vanished people and extinct people regarded themselves and their origins. And they told how their civilization began. They say that long ago there was an island in what they referred to as the Atlantic Ocean. It would be beyond the 12th bow. It's a form of geographical reference. The Atlantic Ocean, beyond the 12th bow. The 12th bow was regarded as a line corresponding to the Straits of Gibraltar. And they said that beyond this 12th bow into the Atlantic Ocean, there was an island called Sekret Aru. And Sekret Aru means the field of reeds. And that refers to a place of great wisdom and knowledge, because the reed was synonymous with a pen, a writing utensil. And if you had an entire field of reeds, it was an indication, it was a poetic metaphor for a place of great literacy and learning. And on this island called Sekret Aru, the field of reeds, human beings and gods lived together in harmony. The gods gave them everything that they knew so that human beings could become almost godlike. Over time, human beings became arrogant, felt they were as good or better than the gods, dispensed with them, didn't need them anymore. The gods cursed Sekret Aru, collected a few virtuous followers into a solar boat, so they say. The gods and these chosen select people got on board this boat. One of them was a man god. His name was Thoth, otherwise known as Thoth The Greeks called him Hermes. The Romans called him Mercury. He was known originally as Faust. That's the earliest known name for him. Also known as Tahuti. And he was entrusted with the emerald tablets, or the emerald tablet. And on this stone was supposedly inscribed all the high wisdom of the gods, and the stone itself possessed a great magical power. And the magical power was to make oneself feel one's spiritual potentiality. And as the keeper of the emerald tablet, or tablets, I'm not quite sure whether it was plural. The original, I feel, was singular, the emerald tablet. They got on board the solar boat, and as they left Sacred Aru, being cursed, sank into the sea with most of its inhabitants. The solar boat then landed at the Nile Delta. Thout and the other gods disembarked, and through the power of the emerald tablet, he was able to upgrade, as it were, the people who had been living there in the Nile Valley, rather primitive people, upgraded their spiritual and intellectual capacities, and because of the infusion of these new people coming in from Sacred Aru, these man gods, as it were, of native people, thus Egyptian civilization was built. This is the story that Manetho gives us. The name Emerald Tablet is also descriptive. It doesn't mean it was actually made out of emeralds, but it was a tablet. It only refers to a stone, a power stone, because the Emerald Tablet changed names when it got to Egypt. It was set up on top of a great pillar in the middle of a very simple spiritual precinct, referred to as An, A-N. In Egyptian, the Greeks later knew it as Heliopolis, or the city of the sun. And this great pillar was erected, and on top of the great pillar was put the emerald tablet. And while the emerald tablet was on top of this pillar, Egyptian civilization came together for the first time in the building of the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid is a work of construction without parallel on earth that would have required the labor of every single man, woman, and child of this society to create. And the Great Pyramid, I'm really cutting to the quick here. I know there's a lot of questions here, a lot of differences of opinion. Hopefully I've developed it more thoroughly in this work. The Great Pyramid's chief purpose had numerous purposes, but its chief original purpose was to fuse two different peoples into a new people. Because by creating a massive public works project, they could put all their energies together for this one single purpose. And so the Great Pyramid, in fact, does symbolize ancient Egypt, because it is the infusion of the energies of these two peoples, the native peoples who lived in the Nile Delta, and these new peoples, bearers of a high civilization, coming in and working together. In other words, the local people were the labor force. The incoming people from Sacred Aru were the culture bearers of this high civilization, the field of reeds. While the Emerald Tablet was on top of its pillar in Heliopolis, the ruins of Heliopolis still exist to this day. Not much left of them. Archaeologists have found them, identified them. While it was on top, the Great Pyramid was being built. So now the Great Pyramid is not, as archaeologists say, built maybe 2,600 years before Christ, 400 or 500 years after Egypt had already started. No, it was built right at the beginning, before the beginning of Egyptian civilization. For further information on this, there's an author I highly recommend. His name is Kurt Mendelsohn. He wrote a book called The Middle of the Pyramids about 40-some years ago. He's right on it. This was a public works project, a social project. It had other functions, as I say. The chief overall function declared was not, hey, we're going to make this great, impossibly huge building, 450 feet high originally. It was the tallest building on Earth until the creation of the Eiffel Tower at the end of the 19th century. And so more miracles about that building than I have time to discuss. But the purpose of building the Great Pyramid, the public word put out on it, why it was being built, not just as a public monument, was to house the Emerald Tablet, the most single precious object that had been secured rock from Sacred Aru, while it was waiting on top of its pillar, Heliopolis. When the structure was nearing completion, the Emerald Tablet was transferred from Heliopolis, not far away from the Giza Plateau where it is today, and installed inside what's known as the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, in its own granite coffer. The moment that it was moved inside, it was no longer referred to as the Emerald Tablet. It is now referred to as the Benben Stone, or the Bennu Stone, B-E-N-N-U. And that name is translated variously and accurately with all the translations as the Firestone, the Stone of Destiny, or the Stone of the Phoenix. The Phoenix, of course, is a mythological bird. Every 144,000 years bursts into flame and perishes. And then another 144,000 years is reborn from its own ashes. Obviously, it's an astronomical, astrological symbol. How that relates to all this, I don't know. I do not have all the answers to this question. It's a lot more questions than answers, but I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch on these things. How this great object, this great treasure, became the heart of the Great Pyramid and was sealed in its granite coffer. The pyramid was completed. And from that time on, from 3100 BC, that's when this is taking place, the beginning of Egyptian civilization, all the way until about 1200 BC, that same time parameter I mentioned yesterday, interestingly enough, when there was the great copper mining taking place here. There was a period, an extended period, not of centuries, but of millennia, of fundamental world peace and enormous progress. High civilizations elsewhere sprouting into existence. The first attempts at medicine, and great attempts at medicine. You know, one of the things the Egyptians had in their, it was invented right from the beginning of Egyptian civilization. They had a pregnancy test, an accurate pregnancy test. The pregnancy test wasn't reinvented, coincidentally, until 1921. After the Dark Age that separates the end of Egypt from now, all this was lost. It was picking up the tiny fragments of this. This is where history, archaeology, and mythology have taken us. That this object from this island across the sea was installed in the Great Pyramid, taking us this far. On the other side of the world, in the Valley of Mexico, there is the story of Aztlan, A-Z-T-L-A-N. And this was a story that was told to the Spanish by the Aztecs, and before the Aztecs, the Toltecs had it, before them the Maya had it, goes all the way back. This is a Mesoamerican story. Tradition, a fundamental tradition of civilizations that were in Middle America. And they said that their ancestors came from a place called Aztlan. It was also in the Atlantic Ocean, where men and gods had lived together in harmony, and then because of God's misbehavior, human beings' misbehavior, the gods cursed Aztlan. The survivors came to Mexico, bearing with them a sacred crystal known as the Giran Goggle. I have a photograph of it, which I apparently am not allowed to show you, but it is in here. The Giran Goggle, sacred crystal, a power crystal. It's described in the Maya Chronicles, Popol Vuh, as a power crystal. Interestingly enough, to even seal the comparison with ancient Egypt, the name Aztlan means field of reeds. Field of reeds means, amongst the Aztecs, precisely the same as it meant to the ancient Egyptians. So here you have two totally different peoples on opposite sides of the world, no other indication of contact between the two, yet they both talk about the same tradition on an Atlantic island, high culture, bringing a power crystal, and the name for the island is exactly the same whether it's in the valley of the Nile or the Valley of Mexico. So it's cross-referencing some shades of Atlantis? I think so, but that's it. Whole other story. Mythology, archaeology, and history have taken us up to this point. Why would they install a beautiful, large crystal, however valuable, inside this enormous building? This building without compare. I visited Egypt for the first time. I took a tour like anybody else, like millions of other people have done, inside the Great Pyramid. Now you would expect when you go inside the Great Pyramid that, along with the rest of Egyptian civilization, the walls would be covered with magnificent hieroglyphs, there'd be statues everywhere, paintings, all the enormously ornate, detailed greatness of ancient Egypt. No. When you go inside, there's a very small corridor, about this wide. Even a shrimp like me has to stoop to get down. Then you walk for a little while through this corridor. It opens up in a larger, totally undecorated corridor. Never was any decoration there. No indication of statues, paintings, hieroglyphs, zip, nothing. Then you go up. Well, now they've included a wooden staircase. You walk up this wooden staircase to a great, what they call a gallery. It's about 150 feet. Nothing to look at. It's all just, just let it go, because I won't have time. Thank you for trying. You see, you go up this gallery, it's kind of high, and they've illuminated it so it looks nice. There was no indication of illumination in the past, no torch marks, nothing like that. Then you go into the king's chamber. It's a little boxy thing, 30 by 30 by 30 feet. And there's a granite sarcophagus where the crystal used to be, there. And that's it. That's the whole thing. And then you can go down some other passages to the so-called Queen's Chamber, which is even more small and totally undecorated. The internal configuration of the Great Pyramid is the most un-Egyptian sight in all of Egypt. And of course, some people will try to say, archaeologists will try to say, well, this was just a tomb for some nobleman, a pharaoh. Well, if that's the case, well, they didn't have a nicer internal configuration. I mean, what's this tiny little room and corridors? And the other problem, of course, is the Egyptians, when they bury their pharaohs, as you know, they had these enormous sarcophaguses. They were huge. Trying to get something like that through a corridor this big and it goes at right angles? I don't think so. That's not going to work. So the idea of a tomb is totally out of the question. Everything you've read, everything you've heard about the Great Pyramid, when you stand in front of this object, stand in front of the Great Pyramid, they all melt away like butter in the hot sun. They make no sense whatsoever. So what's going on? Why would anybody build this? Obviously, the internal configuration of the Great Pyramid is not for public access. It's not a tomb. The Granite Sarcophagus, so-called sarcophagus, is a crummy piece of work. And the Egyptians, as we know, were highly skilled craftsmen, maybe the greatest craftsmen of all time. They worked in granite easily, like you work in wax. But yet this is just as a simple box made out of granite. Never has any indication of any burials ever been found, not only in the Great Pyramid, but in the over 90 known pyramids in Egypt. Not one burial has ever been found. Not one. They found a burial in one pyramid, and the archaeologist says, oh, this proves it. Well, then when they carbonated the body, they found it was like thousands of years after the pyramids. It was obviously an intrusion by some other culture. None of the pyramids were used for burials, not one. Many of the other pyramids have internal configurations like the Great Pyramid. Very simple corridors, a few little chambers, that's it. What's the purpose of this? That's the natural thing people think when they look at this. This is not a ceremonial place. This is not a place for burial. What could this be? If you look at the Great Pyramid when it was in its original prime, it differed from the way it looks today. it was covered completely with limestone, beautiful polished limestone, undecorated, but limestone. That limestone is of the Great Pyramid is completely stripped away because when followers of Islam took over Egypt after Egypt fell, they stripped off all of the limestone and built their mosques with it. So some of the mosques you see there today are built with some of the limestone stripped off the Great Pyramid. The very top of the Great Pyramid does not come to a point. Yes, interesting enough. 30 by 30 by 30 foot square. Same dimensions as you see inside the Great Pyramid's king chamber. And the top of it had not a single stone. That was originally, archaeologists, is another thing, they had to backtrack. They said, oh, there was a big stone up there and it's missing now. And it was probably made of solid granite. Well, if that was the case, construction engineers tell us it would have completely deformed the entire pyramid itself. The whole thing would have collapsed. It would not be able to support that kind of weight up at that point. The Arabic traditions are quite clear that there was a small room at the top. The room was sheeted with solid gold. And there are Egyptian references, not many, very few survive, to the Great Pyramid that show, there are paintings of the Great Pyramid that show it with a gold apex. So we believe that there was kind of a open space, sheeted in gold. So for years, since I was a kid, I figured, what is this place? Like everybody else, the riddle of the Sphinx, the riddle of the pyramid. I won't go through the whole thing, but one day, it just hit me, as it were. I had an interesting experience. I was looking through the Encyclopedia Britannica for something else. And I'm flipping through it, and I'm familiar with what the internal configuration of the Great Pyramid looks like. You can go to any library and look up ancient Egypt, and you'll see the Great Pyramid, and they'll have a cutaway, and they'll show what's inside. It's familiar, simple thing. So I was looking through the Encyclopedia Britannica for something else, and I'm flipping through it real fast, and I thought, oh, there was a configuration of the Great Pyramid. I thought it was a cutaway of it. I thought, well, it's in the wrong section. It's in the T section. So as I got through the Great Pyramid, I flipped back, and I saw something that resembled in every detail the internal configuration of the Great Pyramid. It's an electronic device called a transducer. A transducer is an electronic device that was invented about, maybe 130 years ago. Very simple device. It transforms mechanical energy into electrical energy. Give you an example. Remember the old phonograph records we used to have, phonograph players, not LPs. The tone arm that you have on the record, that's a transducer. What it means is that there's a needle, it's in the grooves, the record goes around, little vibrations come through that needle, and they go into a crystal. It's a little teeny crystal in there. When those mechanical vibrations, the grooves in the record, hit the crystal takes those mechanical energies, transforms into electrical impulses. Very simple device. And electrical impulses go into the wires and catch music. It's a transducer. So I got a comparison of the cutaway of the Great Pyramid. It's a template. So I thought, eureka, I figured this out. Well, I figured, well, I learned later on, other people have come to the same conclusion. And what is that conclusion? Hard as is to believe. The Great Pyramid is a machine. The Great Pyramid was designed and built as a machine. It is the largest electrical device on Earth, has never been equaled or surpassed, and it is made specifically, number one purpose, to function as a transducer. Why would anybody build a transducer in the middle of the desert? What do you need that for? If you create a transducer of that size and that weight, unimaginable weight, and it is a transducer. Let's say, for the sake of argument, the Great Pyramid is a transducer. It is situated directly over a major fault line where seismic energies have been concentrated for time out of mind. Now there's been, Earth changes over time. It's not as seismically active now as it was 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, geologists will tell you that was one of the great seismically active areas of the North African continent. Now what happens when there's a major earthquake or seismic activity? It doesn't have to be major. Seismic activity going on underneath the Great Pyramid, if it is a transducer. It's taking those mechanical energies and transforming them into electrical energies. What happens then, it does a number of things. Number one, it dissipates the destructive effects of an earthquake. So let's say, again, for the sake of argument, you have got in the possession of a high civilization. You're out on an island somewhere. Uh-oh, the place is sinking. Something's wrong. We have to leave. There's a political problem. Who knows? Anyway, you've got to get out. Where will we go as a people? Well, the Nile Valley looks really great. Well, I can tell you one thing. It's impossible to starve in Egypt because the soil is so incredibly rich. You can throw any seed in there and it will grow. The growing seasons are incredibly long. The trouble is, it's earthquake prone. Not today as much as it used to be in the past. It still does. The last major earthquake, there was an earthquake swarm in the Nile Valley about 800 years ago. Geologically, it's not very long. A major swarm. That swarm took place again today. Cairo would be dust. That was a major earthquake swarm. Swarm meaning one series of earthquakes. So it was an earthquake-prone area. I say not so much now as in the past. So let's go to the Nile Valley. Trouble is, every time we build something, it's going to be knocked over. We have a lot of earthquakes here. So we're going to build this geotransducer. I'm really simplifying it, believe me. I haven't got much time for this. Very little than that. But I suggest, and I can only conclude, that in fact, the Great Pyramid was built by an unimaginably advanced technological people who based their greatness not on the same kind of civilization that we have. They based their greatness on long-term observation of nature. And that is what led them to create this tremendous device. There's a phenomenon known as the Andes globe. It's considered only a fable until it was actually photographed only about maybe 40 years ago. The Andes globe is this. In South America, in the Andes Mountains, there are some of the mountains that have large concentrations of granite. And granite is a very crystalline rock. South America is also very much earthquake-prone. Major earthquakes there happen all the time. During the course of an earthquake, in certain areas of the Andes, it's been noticed that the tops of the mountains will glow blue. The blue haze, flickering, electronic-like blue haze, flickering above the mountains. This was considered only a fable, a myth, and so it was actually seen, measured, and photographed. Now it's a part you can go on the internet and find talk about it. The same phenomenon has been now photographed in Japan. What happens is that when the earthquakes take place in the ground, of course you know how earthquakes happen, you have the two plates grinding over each other, creating all this tremendous tectonic stress, and then they go over each other and there's your earthquake. But before the actual earthquake takes place, you have this tremendous geologic stress going on. That stress is transformed, transmuted, this mechanical energy is transmuted by the crystal inside the granite to create what is known as a corona discharge. Corona discharge is a huge amount of negative ions, and when they're shot into the atmosphere, they create this electronic blue haze. As recently as 1996, I believe, it was a reader of mine. He contacted me while I was at work on this book. He said that he had been visiting the Great Pyramid and he had to tell me about a wonderful experience he had. He wanted to know if I knew anything about it. He was out at a place called Mina House, which is a very expensive hotel just outside of Cairo. We have the best view of the pyramids. And he had gone on a tour and really enjoyed himself. And he wanted to take a look at the Great Pyramid just before they left in the morning. He was out very late at night. He's looking at the Great Pyramid, something like about 3 o'clock in the morning, from his hotel balcony, and he sees this blue haze flitting in an irregular way over the top of the Great Pyramid. That is part of the Andes glow phenomenon. In the late 19th century, about 1880 something or other, Siemens, you may have heard of him, Siemens, like Siemens Electric in Germany, the founder of Siemens Electric Company. He had climbed the top of the Great Pyramid with his friends, and they were going to have a party on top of the Great Pyramid. And they were brought up there by a local Egyptian guide, and they're on top of the Great Pyramid, and Siemens, who had a lot of fillings in his mouth, felt his teeth tingling on top of the Great Pyramid. And being the electrical genius that he was, he took a wine bottle. He talks about this in his own autobiography. Took a wine bottle, emptied out most of the wine, and wrapped some tinfoil around it. And he said, I feel there's some kind of electrical force going on around here. And he stood up as high as he could. And he held the bottle high up over his head and began to spark blue electrical sparks. And so everybody thought, oh, that's amazing, you know. And the guide thought that he was conjuring the devil. And so the guide grabbed one of his associates and was starting to throw them off the top of the pyramid. It was pretty serious. And so Siemens, I'll say, he was an electrical genius, he knows all about this. He knows about polarity, you know. So he took the bottle and he pointed it at the Egyptian guy, and a great blue spark leapt from the bottle to the guy's nose, and he ran down the pyramid. But it's interesting that this blue light phenomena is still seen occasionally dancing around the top of the Great Pyramid, which is interesting because the gold that's at the top of the Great Pyramid is removed, long gone, and the limestone is all gone. Now that's great because limestone, the Great Pyramid is made of granite, which is a superb electrical conductor, but yet it's shielded completely in limestone, just as a transducer is shielded in asbestos, and the transducer also needs a conductor. If you go into at its apex, and if you go into any basic book on electronics, you'll read that the best transducers have either a silver, preferably a gold apex, so that the corona discharge isn't diffused. It's so I believe that that's what the Great Pyramid was. I've taken too much time on that. Where's the ark in all this? The Great Pyramid functioned perfectly. Its civilization flourished until the year, this would be, I'm guessing really, because I have to go back to look at it. My mind is awash with all these numbers and facts and so on. But I'm trying to give you, I think, a pretty good fact. It would be around 1250 BC. I'm pretty comfortable with that. About 1250 BC. In 1250 BC, Egypt was invaded by a major coalition of what they call the Sea Peoples. These were people that had been displaced by the Trojan War. They had lost their kingdoms, but they had not lost their fleets. So they reorganized their fleets and became kind of a nation of pirates, actually. And they took over parts of the Mediterranean. They became very powerful, and they invaded Egypt around 1250. And in 1250, they took over the northern part of Egypt. They took over the Nile Delta. They took over the area where the Great Pyramid stands to this day. And in doing that, the Egyptians looked like they were on the verge of losing their culture. They were getting beat at every turn. The vizier, or modern terms, the governor of that area, became what is known today as a kind of a quisling. Turned against Pharaoh, and he sided with the Sea Peoples. He said, well, I'll be your administrator here, just keep me out of your administrator and make sure there's no trouble, and we'll make sure that your military rear is all right. You go ahead and continue to take over Egypt. Yeah, as a real first-class trader. The Sea People said, okay, hey, that's fine, you can be our governor now. So they go down there. The Pharaoh at that time, his name was Meren-Ptah. The Sea Peoples had chosen this particular time to attack because he was an old man. In those days, being in your 60s, at my age, would be considered very old, and certainly too old to be Pharaoh. And so they figured, well, we'll beat up Egypt with this old Pharaoh there. So they're winning. And this vizier, his name was Ramosa. And Ramosa was not an Egyptian. That was his Egyptian name. He was a foreigner who had risen very high through the hierarchy of Egyptian politics. Nobody knows exactly where he was from. Sometimes he's described as an Asiatic, whatever that could be. Syrian, Hebrew, I don't know, but he was not Egyptian. Anyway, and he turned against Pharaoh, and he led a kind of a revolution, and he purged a lot of the Egyptian administration, and killed a lot of people, and did terrible blasphemies against the temples. He made the priests slaughter all the sacred animals, and rather bad things. The worst crime, though, he committed, the unthinkable sacrilege, is that he and his followers broke into the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid had always been protected by a cadre of military priests known as the Rostau, R-O-S-T-H-A-U, known as the Watchers or the Guardians. And they made sure that no one approached the Great Pyramid except Pharaoh and the high priests. No one had access. You could go up to the Great Pyramid, pretty close, but you could not touch it or go inside it, except Pharaoh and the priests. And Ramosa and his followers slaughtered the Rostau with the help of the Sea Peoples, killed them off, broke inside the Great Pyramid, and Ramosa, being one of the high priests himself, knew exactly where that crystal was and stole the crystal out of the king's chamber. That's how it's disappeared. That's why it's no longer in that Granite Sarcophagus. He and his followers then brought it back to his temporary capital. Why would he want that stone? Because it was described as the stone of destiny, a power stone. Whoever possessed that had tremendous power. You could transmute the power of earthquakes. Who knows what else you could do with it? Things turned out differently than people expected. The old Pharaoh proved more wily than anybody expected, and he turned the tables on the Sea Peoples. This is a matter of historical, rather archaeological record. He turned the tables on the Sea Peoples. He organized his archers in Egypt. The Egyptian archers were the best. And they slaughtered the Sea Peoples, pushed them out, drove them out. As they're driving them out, old Ramosa and his followers, he had quite a few by that time, said, "Oh boy, we had better leave. Let's go with the Sea Peoples. Sea Peoples, not a chance, no room on the boats. Take care of yourself." Sea Peoples are in the process of going through their own Dunkirk when Pharaoh was hot on their heels, and they grab the stone and they leave. Several thousand of these people. It's like a community of people. And this community of people were Egyptians, some of them were foreigners. The Nile Delta had been a place of, well, like New York City. Everybody was there. So you had people from all over the known world at that time, including native Egyptians. So, because they had sided with Ramosa, this traitor, who had stolen the most precious treasure, they left. And as they went eastward, Pharaoh found out about it, Pharaoh Meremta. He came after them. And as he's going after them, there is a natural disaster that takes place. You may have heard about this as the eruption of a volcano called Thera in the eastern Mediterranean. And it caused tremendous geological upheaval all across the Mediterranean, including Egypt. Now when you realize that this fellow's name was Ramosa, and that this story seems to have parallels elsewhere in history, there's a certain familiarity that results. Because after Ramosa finally made his getaway across a place called the Red Sea, which became impassable because of all the geologic problems going on at that time, the people got away scot-free. They came to the base of a mountain, Mount Sinai, it's called. And at Mount Sinai, they reorganized themselves. They called themselves the chosen people. They had been chosen to escape from this great catastrophe. And Ramosa and his wife Miriam were no longer referred to by their Egyptian names because everything Egyptian was now hated, and his name was now Moses. This is all laid out by a brilliant Hebrew scholar who's taken a lot of flack, actually, from his own people. His name is Schechter. He's still alive. He's from Holland. They carried with them this stone. And they put it in a box which supposedly Yahweh, God told them to put it in, and coated it with gold. And then this is the Ark of the Covenant. The covenant is that stone. They inscribed on it what was supposedly inscribed with this old language. Now back in 1959, now we're going to jump far into the future. In 1959, the University of Wisconsin, right here, a class project was undertook. It was undertaken by a professor of ancient history. Someone had raised the question of whether the ark was real or not. And so the dimensions for the Ark of the Covenant are spelled out in great detail in the Old Testament. An interesting thing, there is no other object throughout the entire Old Testament that is mentioned as often or described in as great detail as the Ark of the Covenant. Nothing comes close to it. And going on those details, those dimensions, an exact replica of the Ark of the Covenant was made. Not minus the gold, of course. The university budgets being what they are, so it was made out of wood. They made an exact duplicate of the Ark of the Covenant. One of his students brought up the interesting parallel that it seemed to resemble the dimensions somewhat of the sarcophagus inside the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber. 2 years later, the same professor, his name was Henshaw. He died about 15 years ago, but he wrote it up. It's in university reports. Professor Henshaw took this model that his students had made as a class project to Egypt, went inside the Great Pyramids, no problem, then as now. He found something kind of interesting. That the exact duplicate, according to the biblical description of royal cubits, transferred into feet and inches, roughly about 3 feet long, a little over 2.5 feet, 2 feet wide, fit inside the open space of the granite sarcophagus as though it had been like a glove. That there was less than an inch clearance all around the sarcophagus's internal features. Interesting. What are the chances of the internal configuration of the granite sarcophagus matching exactly the Ark of the Covenant? Not only that, he was intrigued to see if there were other parallels, and there are. I mentioned that the internal dimensions of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid are 30 by 30 by 30 feet. It's cube. And if you look at the description of King Solomon's temple that he built on Mount Moriah, the temple was built specifically, exclusively, to house the Ark of the Covenant. And in its own Holy of Holies, known as the Dibir, D-I-B-I-R, means literally Holy of Holies, it's its own room. There the Ark of the Covenant was set. 30 by 30 by 30, the exact same dimensions. When the Ark of the Covenant was set up finally in Jerusalem, jumping away many centuries, it was finally set up. The Old Testament tells us that just like the Rostau in Egypt, the watchers who had control over the Great Pyramid and its crystal inside, known as the Ben stone, the stone of destiny, so the Hebrews now had a class of warrior priests called the Levites, and only the Levites had access to the Ark of the Covenant, no one else. And the chief priest, who was known as the Kahol, high priest, the Kahol, he had access to the Dibir, the Holy of Holies, and the Ark of the Covenant was set only once a year. And that was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It's the only time you can go in there. And the Jews today, Orthodox Jews today, have the same recreation that the Kahal went through when they opened up the tabernacle only on Yom Kippur. It symbolizes the opening of the Debir, King Solomon's temple. And when he went in, he had to put on the ephod, which was mentioned by our friend Tecumseh earlier today. And the ephod was nothing more than an asbestos coat. He had all kinds of headgear. Not only that, he had to have his left ankle chained, had manacles around his left ankle, and a long chain trailing behind him, behind the door that he went into. The door was open for him to go through and then almost closed. His followers, the other Levites, could look through the crack of the door. They were not allowed to go in. The reason why he had that on was because if the ark decided to kill him with a blast of flame that's described, they would pull his body out. During the time that the Israelites had this object, had the Ark of the Covenant, they're dragging it across the Promised Land, trying to go to the Promised Land. What an amazing thing that was. Because the Israelites were very few in number, they had no military background whatsoever. They were nothing more than shopkeepers, merchants, herders, no warriors. And yet this little, untrained, numerically outnumbered people came up against warrior peoples like the Jebusites, the Danites, all these other tribes of people who were fierce warriors, and wiped them out, overcame them. And that's because they used this object as a weapon of mass destruction. One example of that is in the attack on a place called Jericho. In the Bible, it's described that this great fortress called Jericho was standing in the way between the Israelites and the Promised Land. They had to get by it. It was ruled by a military people, had to be overcome. What did the Israelites do? They brought up the Ark of the Covenant, they brought up the Ark of the Covenant, and they did a very strange thing. They got all of the Israelites lined up, and they surrounded the Ark of the Covenant with trumpeters and musicians. And Joshua was commander at that time, so they're right before the walls of Jericho, and all their enemies are lined up on the walls. And Joshua says, on my signal only, all the trumpets are to sound, everyone is to start yelling, making as much noise as possible. Okay, go to it. Everybody starts yelling, the trumpeters are going, nothing happens. All our enemies are on the wall saying, they're very entertaining enemies, but they don't seem particularly dangerous. So then Joshua says, oh, made a mistake. We're going to take the ark up. This was told in Exodus now. You can read this yourself. We're going to take the ark and we're going to move it just a little bit. They moved it a few paces. That's all they did. Lined everybody up again, got the trumpeters set up. Okay, go to it. And you shout, the trumpeters are going, and the walls of Jericho collapsed. The Israelites came in and slaughtered every man, woman, child, and animal. Now, is that just as a story, or is that real? It was an archaeologist, a British archaeologist by the name of Kenyon, Dolores Kenyon. And in the 1960s, late 1960s, I don't know how much time, she verified that Jericho, in fact, she found Jericho. She found the ruins of this site. It's a fairly large, Bronze Age type of fortress. But and her work was verified by her peers. You can go there today and visit Jericho. This is it, the biblical Jericho. Matches all the particulars, time-wise and everything. Strange thing. If you read her report, she says the walls, what's going on? The walls didn't collapse, weren't knocked down. They were, quote unquote, pulverized. So she said, oh, it must have been an earthquake, knocked them down. So then she checked with her geologist friends, and they said, sorry, that is not an earthquake-prone area. We do not know there's been any earthquakes in that area for a time of time. So that is a mystery, supposedly. I suggest that the Ark of the Covenant was used as a sonic cannon. They're yelling, blowing their trumpets, they've set up a sound resonance, and so they back-engineered it, as it were. They transferred sonic energy into mechanical. Pulverized those bolts. And from that victory on, the Israelites went to wipe out their opponents, who outnumbered them, outclassed them in every way. How is it possible that this happened? The Ark of the Covenant is, I believe, this device. I'm not going to be able to speak much longer. But I believe that the Ark of the Covenant was used for two main purposes. It was abused by the Israelites, turned into a weapon. Later on, to their credit, they turned it back. When King Solomon built his temple on Mount Moriah, it was an earthquake-prone spot, a major epicenter. To this day, it still is. Matter of fact, the major epicenter of Israel, Mount Moriah. Then it began to reassume its function as two levels to ameliorate the worst effects of earthquakes so civilization can flourish in an otherwise productive area. But the other aspect of the Ark of the Covenant, the one that we are really most interested in, the one I've addressed not at all, not really needs to be talked about, although touched upon only, is its tremendous spiritual potential. Not as an icon of a particular culture at all, because I hope I've demonstrated that the stone, the crystal inside, was something that did not belong to the Israelites, and really not even to the Egyptians. They had always inherited it. When this device, whether it's the Great Pyramid or the Ark of the Covenant, whatever its configuration, whatever its cultural inflection is, whenever it's being used, whenever it's being activated, it transforms mechanical energy into electrical energy, yes, but what is the form of that electrical energy? Negative ions. And you know that if you go to hospitals today, negative ion therapy is used for people who have problems with conventional anesthesia. And it's found that patients who are subjected to concentrated amounts of negative ions commonly experience spiritual phenomena. I'm in the presence of God, I see angels, I feel a tremendous sense of euphoria and peace. Those experiences are now understood because the negative ions affect a part of the brain called the hippocampus. It's a little curlicue at the back of the brain related to the pineal gland. And that whenever your hippocampus is stimulated, either by negative ions or by a good meal or something pleasurable, sometimes you have a sense of spiritual upliftment. Now imagine the Great Pyramid, which is putting out a colossal, an unthinkable amount of negative ions. It is irradiating an entire society. And what is the result? This great Egyptian civilization that flourished for 3,000 years. Will ours last 3,000 years? Will ours last 300 years? So the high function of the Ark of the Covenant, this stone, is to bring out your spiritual potential. When you work with crystals, as New Agers do today, they're kind of on the track to that. It's to feel your soul. It's like a mind boost. An intellectual boost as well. You may have seen a film years ago called Forbidden Planet, where they put these electrode-type deals on people's minds and they give them big mind boosts. In effect, that's what this was. I don't have time to tell you where the Ark of the Covenant is.